And then suddenly we have a meaning crisis, because what if it's just mechanics out there and it's mechanics in here? And so nothing I say or do or think matters.
Today on Reset, we go back to the beginning with Paul VanderKlay. He is the pastor of Living Stones Community Church in Sacramento, California. He's more popularly known as the pastor to the intellectual dark web. He's been interested in Jordan Peterson and the meaning crisis surrounding him for many years, having interviewed Jordan Peterson and commented on many of the movements within the intellectual dark web. We have a conversation together about Genesis chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. We start at the end of that. What kind of humanity is being portrayed in Genesis 3?
When I was preaching through this text a number of years ago, I was going through the book of Genesis serially. You get the sense in Genesis 3 and 4 that small things are bearing surprisingly bitter fruit. Now, we're not surprised, the reader's not as surprised, but it seems like the characters of the story are as surprised. Jordan Peterson loves to illustrate how compact Genesis 4 is. Every one of these, it's just a series of scenes, and the scenes are so distilled. And there's these word connections. And one of the deep word connections between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 is sin desires you. And this desire word is taken from the curse to the woman, that her desire will be for her husband. And it's very interesting, because in Genesis 3, many people look at that story and say, well, it seems a bit of an overreaction that first God places this tree, and then they are exiled from the garden because they take the forbidden fruit. And it just seems like an overreaction. But then you come to Genesis 4, and this seemingly strange interpersonal imbalanced desire that the woman now has for the man, now sin has for Cain. And of course, it isn't the fact that this sin is some impersonal force that is coming into Cain's life. Cain has brought this in. And so Genesis 3 is this amazingly nuanced, generous story where the man and the woman are not cursed. His capacity to produce from the ground is cursed. The language in the curses is tremendously parallel between his frustration with the ground, his pain and frustration, and her pain and frustration with her womb, which is in a sort of way the productive counterpart of the ground in terms of the roles that Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, are playing there. And it's just these tiny little seeds. And then we get to Cain, and he's the first son. Eve celebrates his birth. The Lord has given me a son. And who is this Cain? Well, look at what he's doing. And again, seemingly tiny things. He's slighted by God because his sacrifice seems just a little bit ineffective compared to his brother. And so he nurtures it and it kills it. And of course, as the chapters go, 4 then leads to all of, again, this cultural productivity, this scientific productivity, and it builds into chapter 5. And it gets, of course, towards the end of chapter 5 to the point of where the Lord looks down and he grieves starting it all. And then, of course, in the flood, he will undo creation and restart it with Noah. But again, with Noah, I had a men's Bible study on this, and they read Noah. And reading through this text again, I notice Noah says nothing through the whole flood story. And the Bible's very careful about first things that a character speaks. The Bible says nothing through the flood story. The best man in the world and his sons and his daughters-in-law are saved. And God at each moment. The only thing that Noah ever does is obeys God. Boom, 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 boom. Finally gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, which is in the Bible this image of human culture and cultivation, and can't handle his wine, is laying naked in the tent. And, one son comes and laughs at him, and Noah gets up and curses the son of his son. And this is the only word we ever get from Noah in the whole story, and it's a word of cursing. And so you see this tiny little seed of sin growing in Genesis 3, killing a brother in Genesis 4, and suddenly murder all over the place in Genesis 5. Pick the best man in the world. He says absolutely nothing, but is compliant through the flood. And then when he finally speaks in Genesis 9, after the flood, what does he say? He curses his son. And of course, it will keep exploding until obviously then he picks, okay, new strategy, one man, one woman. They're going to be the founder of a nation. So let's pick an infertile couple late in years. And, yes, fall into this story because what the meaning crisis says is, I wonder if I'm a person. And these stories open up and say, guess what? You are a person. You have agency. Your choices are consequential, but take a real look at what we are. And what can turn us around.
Yeah, and what we are, according to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, is in the image of God, given this incredible dignity, given this status, given a position that is sort of been between heaven and earth, really. Heaven and earth are kind of the arenas in which we are to live, and somehow all of earth is beneath our feet and heaven is above us. We are at the sort of the fulcrum, the operating system of heaven and earth. Here we are. So what a distinction, what a dignity. And from Genesis 3, we are Adam. We are, here is the crooked timber of humanity. Here is this fallenness. And I wonder if part of the meaning crisis is trying to put together both those things. And I think it's very much this case of discovering we have a nature, discovering we have agency, individuality, particularity, and discovering that we are not as Rousseau imagined us to be, born free and everywhere in chains. I think a lot of the meaning crisis and a lot of the intellectual dark web type stuff, if we want to give it that label, is discovering that we are not blank slates. Would you agree?
Yes. Well, and I'm just amazed at what Jordan Peterson has wrought in this conversation. So here are, you and I both had, basically the theological education that has been offered, late modernity theological education, a little bit of, literary sensitivity in reading the Bible. And Jordan Peterson comes on stage, and in these 15 lectures, and all of the strangeness and quirkiness that Jordan Peterson does sort of unleashes in us a new vista of, with a sort of the strange Augustinian anthropology and a Jungian sensitivity to story and archetypes. And now suddenly we're seeing the text in new ways, and an entire generation begins to read the Bible sort of out of the corner that modernity had painted us into with respect to the Bible. And I think when you look at the meaning crisis, that is the heart of the meaning crisis. That modernity, in a sense, invites us into this strange monarchical vision of the world that says, the world is mechanical, but I am not. Science progresses and says, maybe you're mechanical too. Maybe there's no you in there. Maybe your choices are just the working out of nature. And I think C.S. Lewis beautifully portrays that and anticipates it in his book, Miracles. And then suddenly we have a meaning crisis, because what if it's just mechanics out there and it's mechanics in here? And so nothing I say or do or think matters. And right at the beginning of the story, Adam isn't the sharpest tool in the shed. and Cain is morally defective in ways that are so subtle that only to our horror unfold in one brother killing another because God seemed to not pay enough attention to his sacrifice. And no, there is a person in us, and we might not like who we find, but there is the person, the consciousness that has given us through, of course, he makes the man out of the dust of the earth and breathes into him. We are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. And so even as we destroy ourselves into this midst, he doesn't intervene in terms of taking away our agency, but he says, I am going to come into the story, and in ways they'll be relational, but in ways you can barely comprehend, begin to redeem your agency. So as C.S. Lewis says in the Screw Tape Letters, the Screw Tape says, our Father below wants cattle. It's a very modernistic thing. We're going to mechanize the entire world. We're going to wield it and use it to serve our appetites. Wants cattle who will become food. And what the Father above wants are children who will grow up into sons. And right. You see that even in his, part of what's interesting about the story of Cain and Abel is where's the father and the mother in this? Adam and Eve sort of poof, they disappear. And so God comes in as a father, but not one that says, I'm going to take away your agency so you can't kill your brother. But I am going to begin to shape the story so that Cain, maybe at some point, you will see yourself and you will see me, and maybe you will do what's right and your sacrifice will be received.
Right. And do you see Genesis 1 as painting us that picture of God as well, in that I think many of the Babylonian creation myths and that kind of thing, and certainly many other origin stories, have the gods creating us in order to be cattle, in order to be slaves. Whereas, Genesis, against that backdrop, couldn't be telling a more different story, could it?
Yeah. I like John Walton's treatment of Genesis 1. He notes something I'd never noted before. Genesis 1 is a temple text. It's this glorious celebration of, in a sense, God showing off his humble power under, where unlike all of the competing stories where you have all of these conscious functionaries, the sun and the moon, and they're all going to become rival with egos, you have this glorious picture of God just speaking order into chaos, and it's productive and it's beautiful. And then towards the end of the chapter, in come the man and the woman, and they're his image bearers. And he, in a sense, invites them into the sub-creating glorious story. And what's amazing is that in Genesis 3, then, of course, Genesis 2, it gets very relational. And then you have this other tremendous song of the man seeing the woman, looking around, can't find a helpmate, but then bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And then of course, in Genesis 3, just previously it sang this glorious song because the woman was the best thing he could have imagined. And then what happened here? It was that woman that you gave me. Throws both his father and his wife under the bus, isolating himself as this self-righteous, it wasn't my fault. And these stories just expose us as these tiny little creatures that, and again, back to the story of the prodigal son, where you have these two sons and the father knows best and is just leading these sons patiently, quietly, hopefully into us growing up to be like our Father. And one of, I think, the starkest parts of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, be perfect. A lot of times we think about that in these moralistic senses, but that climax of be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect is right on the heels of God brings the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, the sun to shine on the fields of the generous and the miserly. And this is the perfection that the Father wants to invite us into, which is the glory of Genesis 1.
Right, right. And interestingly, the parallel in Luke's gospel, when he records the Sermon on the Plain, he records that very same line as, be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful.
Yes.
So
yes.
what is God's perfection? Is God's perfection that which excludes the other, or is God's perfection that which actually includes and has mercy on and is gracious and inviting towards? And this is, again, is the character of the God of Genesis 1, who, if you just had Genesis 1, what kind of God are we dealing with? We're dealing with a God who brings life, who brings light, who shares. But that word God, Paul, I mean, that's a problematic word, isn't it, these days? I mean, so many people, they can get on board the Jordan Peterson train, and they can understand all about the 12 rules for life. They can understand all about our original sin. They can take on board so much from Genesis, so much from the Sermon on the Mount. But when it comes to God, they lose all resolution, and they lose all interest in actually kind of digging in, because it just seems such a distant idea. How can you make God believable for us?
I think Jordan Peterson did that in ways that I, as a Christian minister, couldn't have anticipated. You know, one of the things when I watched the conversations between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, you get to the end of the first meeting that they had in Vancouver with Brett Weinstein there. And everyone's a little frustrated because everyone wants to see Sam Harris bully Jordan Peterson out of, any kind of Jesus smuggling. And so then they have this little conversation towards the end where, okay, Jordan, what is the God that you believe in? And Jordan gives this list, which is Sam Harris can't understand and doesn't like. But what listening to it, because of course as a minister, I know a little bit of theology. I was listening to this, and Sam Harris basically says, that's not God. God is this man up in the sky that is, that is capricious and that is somehow insecure. So we have to fluff him up to get what we want. And he's miserly and he's a killjoy. And so the God that Jordan Peterson had described, Sam Harris couldn't recognize. But the God that Jordan Peterson described was the God of creation. This was the God that in Genesis 1, the most astounding thing about the God of the Bible is his humility, how he so often is the author of everything, but doesn't draw attention to himself and waits for himself to be discovered with delight. Now, so what I think Jordan Peterson did for a whole generation was help people get a vision for the God that in Isaiah 6, the angels cry, the whole earth is full of his glory. Why on earth would we have been so lucky to, out of all creation, have the consciousness and the capacities to have dominion out of the earth? Where does that come from? We like to imagine, it's so amazing, late modernity, just keep harping on, we're just like the animals, we're just like the animals. I've never seen my dog say anything like that. We are the stuff of earth, but we're the breath of God. We're so strange. And I think once Jordan had this weird way of both providing a compelling Augustinian anthropology that makes us suspicious of ourselves, but at the same time exposing the outlandish good fortune that we have of having this conscious capacity to recognize ourselves and each other. And the one piece that I think, Jordan so far has not quite yet come to is that he always sort of comes to the edge of recognizing the intimacy with which God, approaches Cain. That Tim Keller, who's one of my favorite Protestant preachers, loved pulling out this phrase from Jonathan Edwards of God's diverse excellencies, because in our limited imagination, we project up unto God, oh, he's judging. Yes, he is judging. But then, or he's negligent. He should have stopped Cain and undercut his agency. No, he's also power giving. Andy Crouch talks about that in his writings on power. His power comes from below. He enables us, and he somehow works humbly, quietly behind the scenes. And the one place where I think I would step in on Jordan's portrayal is that this God is very active. He shines in all that's fair. He's active in mechanisms that we are suspicious of, that I don't imagine any good God would be quite this liberal in offering us agency. We want nanny governments, but our God says, no, here it is. I'm giving it to you. Play with it. And then we do. And so we in modernity have this enormously high view of ourselves, which has no historical warrant and no vision of God. And I think Jordan sort of flipped the script on that and said, no, why don't we look at ourselves, and why don't we look at our astounding good fortune to be sitting in this world with all of this agency.
Yes.
And this is our Father saying, I'd like you to learn how to use this agency as I do. Yeah, it's risky. Yeah, it seems reckless, but this is part of God's strangeness.
Amazing. Fit that together with Jesus. Okay, so here we are in Genesis 1. We've got the heavens and the earth, and we've got God, and we've got humanity. Why don't we just leave it there? Why complicate things with talking about Jesus?
Well, I was just this Sunday, I was preaching on the second commandment, where the second commandment is such a bolt from the blue. You shall not make statues and try to imagine the author of creation as any element of creation. And if you look at the ancient world, it's just craziness. In fact, you can go on the internet and Google idols and Hinduism, and you find all of these lists of why it's reasonable and psychologically practical to make these little statues and to imagine God as a calf. That seems strange to us, but as a human being, as this fatherly figure floating around on clouds. And the second commandment says, take nothing out of creation and represent me by it. And then Jesus comes, and the book of Colossians says he's the icon of the invisible God. And in John, Philip asks him, show us the Father, show us this invisible God. And Jesus says, can't you see the Father? Can't you see the Father in me? And so here comes Jesus. And as C.S. Lewis notes, if Jesus had come to the Hindus or to the Greeks or to the Romans, all of this sort of human aspirational divinity chat by which we like to imagine ourselves as gods wouldn't have had any play, because of course the exile beats out of Israel any flirtation with idols. And so the one culture in the world that was set up by the second commandment now has a man coming and saying, I am the author of creation, and I'll show it when I call out to the storm, as we would call out to an obedient dog and say, peace, be still, sit in your corner. And then chastise the disciples. Don't you know who's in the boat with you? And, this, again, if the second commandment is this just astoundingly philosophical insight that says the author of creation cannot be reduced to any single element in it, then the incarnation of Christ is this astounding second act where the one element of creation that is honored with the status of image bearing now in this image comes to you and says, I'm going to show you the image full on. And what's astounding with Jesus is that we see the same diverse excellencies, contradictory excellencies in Jesus. In the Sermon on the Mount, he's more demanding, and that the greatest prude would look at that and say, would God be this demanding? Oh, yes. And then when the woman comes to Jesus, when he's in the home of the Pharisees, and she's got a sinful reputation in the account, quite undoubtedly earned, and washes his feet with her tears and dries them by letting down her hair. People are like, we don't do this. But Jesus says, no, what she's doing is absolutely appropriate. So he's both so agency affording to us that we say that's negligence, but he's also so demanding of us that we say that's overdone in terms of what you can expect from us. And Jesus says, no, this is me, and I will show you by my generosity, and I will show you by my demandingness that I am the icon of the invisible God. And what's even more audacious is I want you to grow into the same agency I am exhibiting. So I'm going to give you my Spirit. You children that have done this with the world and with each other, I am going to give you the power to heal the sick and raise the dead.
Amazing. It reminds me of John 1:14, the Word of God, the very expression of the Father, comes in the flesh, full of grace and truth, which seems to be a play on the name of God in Exodus 34, when he pronounces his name, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Or another way you can translate that is grace and truth. Love and faithfulness, grace and truth. And those are those diverse excellencies that we see in Christ. The very one who would blast the Pharisees, and then at the end say, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stoned the prophets, how I've longed to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks." And so often I just think, well, if that's not God, I can't be bothered with God. Yeah.
And we see him through the story. That's what's so astounding, is that at the heart of the meaning crisis, there's a suspicion that all stories are bunk. That well, I'm not a story. That stories are these things that we make up to make ourselves feel better. And the story comes along and says, no, the story is the story is what there is, and you yourself are really a story. Yeah, we've got hair and physicality and skin, and we're agents and authors of immense stories in the world because we have all this agency, we have all this power, but at heart we're a story. And God says, I am the author of this story, and I am the best storyteller that you can imagine, better in fact, and I'm going to make you yourself are a story, and I'm going to write you. Open your page to me, trust me, and let me write.
Yeah, which is the way in for C.S. Lewis. So we keep returning to Lewis, but 89 years ago this month, he was having a conversation with J.R.R. Tolkien, where he famously spoke of the myths that they both loved and taught and would eventually write, the great fairy tales. And Lewis said they are lies even though breathed through silver, which is a beautifully poetic way of putting it. And Tolkien says, no, they are not lies. And I wonder if that's a clue for the way into this conversation with people. That, as you say, we tell stories, better stories that remind them of the great story, and confront them with the fact that they are a character, and there is an author and there is a hero. No wonder the stories that we enjoy take the shape that they do. How do we go about that, though?
Well, I think you're right, because so if someone comes full blown into the meaning crisis and they say, okay, there's no such thing as story except I can't help but think in them. There's no such thing as agency except I can't help but live as if I have agency. Okay, well, how are you going to live? Are you going to run around undercutting agency with your science stories and saying there is no real wonder, but I like to believe it on the weekends. And so then you're going to dress up as Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker and say, okay, so if there is no there and there's no nothing after, what's the smartest way to live? Well, why don't you start giving yourself to the story? But part of me knows, okay, part of you knows that's okay. But just give yourself to the story, because if it's all just mechanical all the way on down, I mean, even Sam Harris says, well, it's a movie, watch the movie. Well, what the biggest movies we've seen have been the ones where people are inviting themselves into the story and they really want to go to Hogwarts and they really want to be a Jedi. And well, I think, as again Jordan Peterson noted, well, you can't look at what, you know, Lucas created or J.K. Rowling's created and not recognize, well, there's a father story to all of these stories, that the only reason these stories are gaining traction in our hearts is because they are riffing on this bigger story. So why not live into the bigger story, and why not LARP with an entire community that is becoming Bible nerds? And what else do you have, oh modern man?
Yeah.
And
so LARPing, live action role play. For those who don't know, live action role play.
Right.
And is that what church is?
In many ways it is. And I think and what I'm finding from people is, I just had a wonderful conversation with Ryan Bennett, who talked about IDW protocol, and he was a Sam Harris fan, and he's not a believer at this point, but he listened to Jordan Peterson and was sort of surprised by him, and has been sort of disappointed that in some aspects, some of what he saw in potentiality that Peterson might have started haven't come to fruition. But I hear so many like him who want to live into the story, but there's something in the back of their minds that says, oh no, stories aren't real. Oh no, you don't have agency. Oh no. And it's like, okay, if all of that is true, okay, why don't you push on through to the other side and say, all right, well then why don't I live in the story? Because otherwise I'm just watching the movie. Why don't I live in the story? And the truth is, the more you live into the story, the more you will live in the story. But then you have the question, well, how can I find a story that has all of the morality that the contemporary world seems to own, even beneath the right and the left? And I think that's sort of where Tom Holland's Dominion comes in, because he just sort of rips the cover off and says, guess what? The story we trust is the story of Jesus. And that's the way into the story.
Very specifically. Yeah.
Yes, very specifically.
And it's a really strange, peculiar story. The story of the God who really does give away power.
That's right.
And
that people look at the story of Jesus and say, boy, that's beautiful, but I don't dare live it because, well, yeah, that's a good point. You don't dare live it because if you do what Jesus did in terms of loving enemies, giving away agency to people who are unworthy of it, you might die the way Jesus died, at the hands of people who, of both sides of a vicious culture war, that simply don't understand you. Well, at that point, you're really going to have to lean into the story and say, the story of Jesus only works when you actually finish the story with crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, new heavens and new earth. Then suddenly, now you have the power to pour out your life for people who are unworthy morally for the sacrifice you're to give them, which is, again, the story of God in Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4. Does Cain deserve the mercy of the mark of Cain that keeps the rest of the world from saying, Cain, you murdered your brother, you deserve to die? This is
Right,
the God
right.
that we're talking about, which, again, we read about him in the Old Testament. And, well, is he violent? Is he vengeful? Is he demanding? Well, he can be violent. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. He is demanding, but we see him unclearly. And then in Jesus, Jesus says, Philip, you haven't seen the Father? Can't you see him in me? And yet his disciples looking at him don't get him. So Jesus says,
Right.
I'll give you my spirit and you will become like me.
Right, right. And I think that points to the roadblock that we so often have, which is, do we dare live into the story? Do we dare give ourselves away in order to find our lives? I've encountered, though, a lot of people who, inspired by Jordan Peterson, have thought to themselves, this is the right way to live. I live as though God exists, and I live as though this kind of God exists, a God where you tell the truth even though they crucify you, and you leave it in the hands of whatever to do with you and to do with your truth-telling what reality will do with it. At that stage, they're exercising extraordinary faith. What really strikes me at that point, though, is when they say, oh, but I couldn't believe in the resurrection, for instance, because, I couldn't believe in that kind of stuff. And I'm kind of like, well, you're already believing the story. You're already living into this story in a remarkable, like, you don't need a leap of faith. You need something underneath your feet, because you're already in midair. You've already taken a gigantic, almighty leap. What is the foundation for that leap if the crucified one did not prove himself to be victor? Like, I still reflect on a saying that you said in one of your videos, must be a year or two ago, where you said, if the story is true, it's true on every level. If resurrection is real, it's not just the highest ideal in one domain. It's the highest ideal in every domain, including the physical, including the historical. Talk to me more about that. How do you convince someone of the resurrection? Okay, they love the story. The story's nice. Now convince them that it happened.
It's funny because I watch apologists do this, and I like the minimal facts argument because it seems, I like N.T. Wright's approach to it too. N.T. Wright makes the point that how on earth can you account for Christianity if even someone like Bart Ehrman will admit the disciples thought they saw something, okay? Because why do you, and the image of the disciples before all of this, the story in the gospel says that, they're having all of this glorious success up in the Galilee, and Jesus says, okay, we're going to Jerusalem. And at one hand, the disciples probably thought, now finally the revolution is upon us. We're going to go, and all this power that we've seen Jesus exhibited. Who can defeat a commander who can raise his dead troops to life, who can heal like this, who can, how many ancient battles were determined by a storm. And Jesus, if he can still a storm, he can create a storm. If he can raise the dead, he can, wipe an army out with a word. So, and then Jesus says, we're going to go down to Jerusalem and we're going to lose. I am going to be turned over into the hands of Gentiles, which all of you thinks is the problem of this land. There's way too many Gentiles and their ideas running around. I'm going to be turned over into the hands of Gentiles, and I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise from the dead in 3 days. And what's astounding is nobody believes him. Once they hear crucified, it's like, the cop coming to the door. We go into shock and we don't hear anything. And so then the whole thing flows out like he says, and you would think at least one of those dudes that he names as his top 12 men would bother to take the little trip down to the tomb Easter Sunday morning and say, just on the off chance. No, it's the women who are going to go and do the dirty work, finishing up what the men were too hurried to do on, before the Sabbath. And again, it's just the most astounding story. And these men that are so clueless and so faithless and so worthless suddenly by Acts 4 stand up to the authorities and say, yeah, you can kill me. You did it to our master. We all know that, but I'm not backing down. and I'm not going to hate you, and we're not starting a revolution. And then, the book of Acts says, and they remembered that these men were with Jesus. And so I don't know that the path forward, even especially in terms of human psychology, is, well, we'll convince people of this historical fact, which because it's by virtue of what historical facts are tremendously different one way or another to validate. I don't think people believe in those terms. Almost nobody today will deny that if we exercise and eat right, that we will have better health and look better and a whole bunch of these other benefits that we all want, but somehow can't figure out how to put the ice cream down. This is not the path by which people believe. People want to believe and lean into belief, and as they're leaning into belief, bit by bit by bit, give themselves over to it. And so I don't know, clearly the disciples believed Jesus was raised from the dead. And as N.T. Wright says, that the really surprising thing about those last chapters of the Gospels, of these post-resurrection descriptions of Jesus, is that they are unembroidered. You almost get the sense that the witnesses didn't have a category with which to place that. And so I think we're basically in the same boat. That, I don't remember who it was, some modernist said, I don't believe anybody in church believes in the resurrection. And that person has a point, because the degree to which we believe in the resurrection is displayed by the degree to which we do exactly what Jesus did, which is give our lives generously to people who don't deserve it, with the full knowledge that they might return the favor and take our lives from us.
Right.
And that's, in a sense, where we see true belief in the resurrection. But as modernists and people who've been deeply impacted by secularists, we sit there and think, well, what I really need to do is, upon cross-examination, Jordan Peterson, to my disappointment, failed, said to Sam Harris, almost certainly not. But even Sam Harris can't definitively say, no, he didn't walk out of that tomb. The degree to which I believe in whether or not I can dare to believe that he walked out of that tomb is exhibited by the generosity I exhibit to a world that is fully capable of taking my life. There is the proof of the resurrection. And we see it in the disciples that the religious leaders saw in John and Peter. We saw it in this phase where somehow, some way, the church in late antiquity had people who so believed the resurrection of Jesus had begun that instead of fleeing from a pandemic, they leaned into it without any understanding of modern medicine and said, yeah, caring for these sick people may well likely cost me my life, and very often did, but the tiny numbers of people that they cared for and recovered said, you know what? This world is unstable. It takes our lives all the time. But if there's any way to live, I want to live like the kind of people who cared for me when my own family abandoned me.
Right.
There is proof of the resurrection.
Right. And that so much gels with one of those last resurrection stories in Luke chapter 24, the road to Emmaus. How does Jesus reveal himself to them? He doesn't go, ta-da, it's me. The look on your faces. Like he teaches them the scriptures, and he shares life with them in the meal. And in the context of the story, and in the context of life shared, belief comes. But yeah, that's got to be a pattern for us, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, if I had been raised from the dead, my first stop would have been Pontius Pilate and Herod and the Sanhedrin to say, "Look at me now. How
remember
do you
me,
like
boys?"
Me now?" That's right. And Jesus doesn't do that. And it's like, why wouldn't you? Again, we imagine that, okay, so let's imagine there was a video camera and someone out there sees the soldiers falling down. And in fact, one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Peter, which the church rejects, one of the Gospels that has Jesus coming out of the tomb then they can't help but have this other cross floating behind him with a mouth on it. And it's like, and so, no, I think that ambition of ours to set a video camera outside the tomb doesn't fully appreciate how we are. And to me, one of my favorite movies, The Truman Show, which of course is this parable, because Christoph is up in the sky and True Man is the character and all of this stuff. My favorite point of the most telling point of the movie about human nature is the world is wrapped. Will Truman walk off of Christoph's set out into the bold, I won't get too much exegesis into the movie, out into the bold world, and he walks out, and then Christoph cut the signal. And in fact, one of the guys who plays the security guards who are watching it actually watches my video and comments sometime. And so, the signal is cut and everyone's like, what? And then where's the remote? Let's find. I mean, I think if you had videotape of Jesus walking out of the tomb, it wouldn't have the impact on us that we all imagine it would. We as human beings, that's not how we're wired. We are not rational in this way. And so I think Christ gives us exactly the witness to the resurrection that is effective, which has always been his followers living like him and dying like him.
Yeah.
That's how we believe.
Right. Very well put. And Paul, I know you need to get on with your day there in Sacramento, but maybe just one final question. If all this is true, why do you do what you do?
This comes back to the answer that I just gave about the witness to the resurrection. I'm 57 now, and I pastor a church of a lot of people in their 70s and 80s and more in their 90s. And, you begin, the older you get, part of the reason churches are so full of old people is that despite our youth biased culture, if you live long enough in this world and you pay attention, you begin to learn a few things. I think about my father was probably the most undirective man you could imagine. He was not one who offered very much advice. He was not one who micromanaged, my upbringing. In some ways, some of his sins were probably more negligence. He was a minister and he was busy doing for people in Paterson, New Jersey, mostly poor African Americans. Paterson, Reuben Hurricane Carter came from Paterson. If you want to get a little picture of Paterson, I grew up in, listen to the song "The Hurricane" by Bob Dylan. There's a picture of the Paterson I grew up in, and I watched my father pour out his life doing common things for people who often needed a little help, would never come to his church. And, if he had to move a refrigerator, of course, he would have me, his son, help him. Delivering food to people. And I watched him pour out his life for many people who couldn't reward him financially because they didn't have any money and didn't necessarily become vital church goers. He pastored a struggling church there for 36 years that never became large or noteworthy or thriving in all of the ways that we imagine churches should be. And that's how he spent his life. And I've known many ministers who, after a number of years serving churches, they become jaded and they're bitter because they didn't make much money. They're bitter because their churches didn't realize their dreams. They're kind of worn out with people because people can be petty and tiresome and annoying and demanding. But I remember talking to my father late after he had retired, and what he did when he retired was he just stopped doing some of the administrative stuff that churches had demanded and just led Bible studies and preached whenever he could. And I said, Dad, this is a strange way to spend your retirement. It looks a lot like how you spent your vocational years. I says, do you still like this stuff? He says, I love it more than ever. I believe it more than I ever have. And there is no more powerful thing in the world than a human being really following in Christ's footsteps. And that's a strange thing, because my father died and he didn't by any means have a great fortune. And, the one book that he wrote is kind of this rambling autobiography where he tells a bunch of his tales, and it's way too long and it's got way too many insider stories. But now looking back on my life, I have to say, even though he wasn't a directive father, he showed me what was worth living in life. And it's all these crazy things about, dealing with homeless people and not just homeless people, because they somehow have got some romantic status in our culture, which in many ways is undeserved, because if you actually deal with them, you're just dealing with feces and drug paraphernalia and addicts who can't get sober, and it can be burdensome in and of itself. But even dealing with regular people who have no status, where they can be petty and insecure and short-sighted, they can have all the virtues of Cain. And yet the command is love them. And they may not celebrate you for it. They might in fact crucify you for it, but love them, and love them well. And so if the modernists are right, and all there is mechanisms, and if the latest developments in science suggest that, well, I'm just playing out the script that was imprinted to me by my father and my religious tradition, okay, I do so happily. And my neighbors want me to. They don't want me to be a selfish prig that says, well, I've only got 80 years, so I'm going to get all the jollies I can out of it. Instead, I saw from my father, spend your life as Jesus would have you do it. It not only is the most meaningful way to do it, but it is also the most joyful way to live. John Ortberg tells the story in his book, The Life You've Always Wanted, that he didn't steal, but gave credit to another preacher for, of this woman who's in a crappy nursing home. And as a pastor, you get into nursing homes like this. And, there's this faint smell of urine. Half of her face had been eaten away by cancer or some disease. She was blind. The young seminary student comes and gives her a flower, and because he's just kind of randomly doing acts of kindness. And she says, I'll give it to someone else. There are more people who need it. And sits down and he says, well, you're blind. What do you think about in this crappy nursing home? I think about Jesus and how wonderful he's been to me. And this young seminarian is like, what do you mean how wonderful he's been to you? Look around. This isn't anyone's definition of wonderful. And I see a lot of crazy in the neighborhood I serve in. There are a lot of group homes and mental illness. This kind of crazy people want. And it's not entirely rational, we think. It's only rational if Jesus is real and the resurrection is true and the age to come is a gift given to us better than we can imagine it to be. How else do you want to live? Really? And that's and I don't live up to it, but that's what I've learned, and that's how I want to be.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful testimony to your father. It's a beautiful testimony to the way of Jesus, really. And I hope it inspires many people. Keep doing what you're doing, Paul VanderKlay, because you're touching and reaching a lot of people and meeting them in a place where, where the truth and the goodness and the beauty of Jesus is proving itself to be what we really need in these days. So God bless you and all that you're doing. And thanks for joining us on Reset.
Thank you, Glenn. It's been a pleasure. Keep doing what you're doing. I love what you're doing.